for our Times Talk. I'm Jay. Welcome to another excellent Times Talk. We're really excited for the content today. This has to do with the Holocaust, and definitions of the Holocaust, and legal implications, and social and historical implications of genocide and what genocide means. And so I'll leave it to Dr. Nickell to start the process. Please come up and grab some lunch if you like. And welcome. Thanks for coming.
I feel like it might be a little better just to give everybody 5 minutes to grab food, and then I'll start talking, so this is not extremely awkward for everyone in the room. Everybody has food. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, and just in case, I do have closed captioning on, but if closed captioning says that I said something I didn't, please don't hold it against me, because I say some wild things in class that I've never said before. You can ask the students here in the room. So the idea for today's Times Talk really came about a year ago when I was speaking with Madison and with Grace, the students that work on ADP, about potentially doing this talk based off of my experiences as a Charlie Scheidt Faculty Fellow in Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University this year. And I really wanted to kind of share some of the information that I gleaned from that experience with my fellow colleagues and with students. And it is a little bit of a shift away from what I normally do. Most of you know that I'm firmly rooted in history. I'm a historian. I study and peddle in the past, right? But atrocity prevention is very much a contemporary thing. It's a thing that we all should be doing right now. Luckily, I got that undergrad in poli-sci to carry me through, right? I see a lot of poli-sci people in the room today. So today's talk, I'm going to talk about a few things. The first thing I want to do is talk about kind of the idea of genocide, some of the core ideas of mass atrocity, and what they are legally. We often use these words like they are things from Webster's dictionary that you can kind of use and abuse in conversation. But the term genocide is a legal term with real legal implications, as are some of the other terms that we associate with mass atrocity crimes. So we're going to talk about those first. And then we'll kind of talk a little bit about the process of genocide and some things that perhaps we can do even here in this room to prevent genocide and other mass atrocity crimes. But I would be remiss as a historian to not start with a historical story. The term genocide is actually a relatively new term. It was only coined around 1946, 1947. But the act of genocide itself is something that's much, much older, right? It was a term coined to deal with something that had been happening really since the beginning of humanity in some way, shape, or form. And the individual who would coin this term is a young Polish-Jewish lawyer by the name of Raphael Lemkin. And Lemkin was a young man in law school, and he witnessed kind of this like trial of the century that was playing out. So young legal students were interested in it. It was the trial of Saul Nickell, and he was tried with the murder of a high-ranking Turkish official. He had murdered this Turkish official because this Turkish official was culpable in the genocide against the Armenian population. Though genocide wasn't a term yet, right? And he couldn't figure it out as a young legal student that the only person who was legally responsible for a crime in this situation was Saul, and not the Turkish individuals that killed well over 1 million Armenians. So he went to his legal professor and he said to him, if it's a crime for him to kill one man, why is it not more of a crime to kill more than 1 million men? And his professor responded with what you see here on this slide. He said, imagine you're walking down the road and you pass a farm surrounded by a fence. You see the farmer picking up chickens and killing them one by one. You step over the fence to try to stop the farmer from killing more chickens. Who has committed the crime? You have, because you have trespassed on the farmer's land. That is how state sovereignty works. Any government can do whatever it wants to its own chickens, right? It was not legally against the law for a state to kill its own people. This was within the law. And Lemkin, even as a young man in the 1920s, started trying to come up with some sort of legal framework to deal with this new crime he's thinking about, this crime of killing a people. And he would come up with that after quite a bit of thinking. He's actually got this famous journal you can look at online if you're interested, where he jots down his notes on what to call this thing. And he has a couple different ideas, but he will ultimately settle on the term genocide. And genocide is actually a combination of the Greek word for race and tribe and the Latin word for the act of killing. It means to kill or to murder a tribe of people. It's important to understand that even as Lemkin understood it, that this term was about not only the act of murdering the people themselves, which is terrible in its own right, but the subsequent death that occurred as a result of this. The loss of entire cultures, entire languages, entire world understandings. This is a different type of crime than some of the other mass atrocities that we will talk about today. When Lemkin first wrote his definition, he wrote the definition that you see on the slide here. And I do apologize for all the words. Most of my students know I hate words, but one of the things I figured out when dealing with legal things is people get really hung up on words. So we're just going to put the words there just in case, right? So he says it's a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of a national group, with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. The objectives of such a plan would be disintegration of the political and social institutions, of culture, language, national feelings, religion, and economic existence of national groups, and the destruction of the personal security, liberty, health, dignity, and even the lives of the individuals belonging to such groups. Genocide is directed against the national group as an entity, so the people as a group. And the actions involved are directed against individuals, not in their individual capacity, but as members of the national group. This will not be the definition that we have today, though. We actually have a very different definition of genocide. And the definition that we have, the legal definition, comes from the UN definition that was developed at the Genocide Convention in 1948. The definition itself is on the slide. I'm not going to read it out aloud to you, but I do want to point out a couple of things in it. You will notice that I bolded and underlined intent to destroy. This is the most important part of the entire definition because nobody will legally call anything genocide unless they can prove intent. There has to be a smoking gun, a document, a statement that says, I intend to kill this entire group of people. And this is often the hardest thing from a legal framework to get this passed, but scholars rely on the legal definition for the most part. So it also will dictate how we scholarly classify certain mass atrocity events. You will also notice that some of the things that Lemkin included in his original definition no longer appear. In particular, there's this concept of cultural genocide. It does not appear in the legal definition. And it will actually get taken out over a course of arguments between the UN officials who have decided what will go in the definition. So you can see the resolution itself will be what we get in number 1, but everything here is kind of these negotiations that occurred on the UN floor. You'll notice that the groups that are targeted gets edited specifically. You'll see that from number 1, is there a difference between that and number 4 that anyone notices? Oh, I can make it bigger. I can put you up. Oh, I told you I don't like these words. There we go.
Yeah. All right.
I can't deliver. So do we notice a big difference between what's kind of missing when we get to the final committee?
Political groups.
Political groups. Does anyone know who's on the main committee? The Soviet Union is involved in the main committee. Does anyone know if the Soviet Union is culpable for, say, in 1932, 1933? right? The mass famine that was inflicted against the Ukrainian population, mostly on the basis of class, right? And so it whittled away at the groups that could be considered targets of genocide. And then you'll also see that the entirely or in part will make it into it. But one of the things that will also change is jurisdictional responsibility. Does anyone know what that means? I know I have law students in this room, like Madison. You don't want to answer me?
It's like who has authority to prosecute?
Exactly, right? Because remember the chicken thing, right? If you go back to that chicken answer, I couldn't step across the state sovereignty of another state to try them for their very bad behavior. And really nobody could until the wake of World War II. And so now they're trying to figure out, okay, who's going to be responsible? Where is it going to be tried? How are we going to deal with these issues? And who will kind of deal with it, right? And when are we going to deal with it? So it waffled back and forth between international concern, universal enforcement, state or territorial enforcement, and it's actually something that is now only tried in one place, which we will talk about later on. Does anyone know where that is? The ICC, right? We'll talk about that in a moment, which won't come into existence until long after the UN Genocide Convention. Genocide is not tried for the first time until long after the Holocaust.
What does ICC stand for?
International Criminal Court.
Thank you.
I will have them on a different slide. But really, right now, in 1948, when they passed the UN Genocide Convention, there's actually no real legal framework to apply it and to try it. In fact, at Nuremberg, which a lot of people think is where genocide is first tried, it is not tried. There are 3 crimes that are tried there. They're all mass atrocity crimes, but none of them is genocide. But the word itself will be used for the first time in Nuremberg by a young American lawyer named Benjamin. He's pretty awesome. And, well, he was pretty awesome. And he will call what happened to the Jewish population genocide. That's the first time it will be introduced into a legal court. Even today, the Genocide Convention remains unratified in several places. This is one of the things about international law, is if a state does not ratify the convention, then they are not subject to being tried for genocide. And this will also apply to the Rome Statute, what we'll talk about later. And some states, a lot of the states that have not yet succumb or join the UN Genocide Convention are the ones that are in gray here. Does anyone want to kind of guess why?
The one that really stands out to me is Japan, and I think it kind of reflects maybe Japan's reluctance to be more actively involved in international affairs in a lot of ways.
Nobody wants to comment on the other places that are overwhelmingly gray?
Like Africa?
Countries that are not done committing the genocide.
Right.
Well, I mean, there are lots of countries here that are actively committing genocide at this very moment who have ratified, right? These are also countries that have suffered a great deal of violence that was inflicted from many of the green colors right there, right? There's going to be a lack of faith in international institutions in places that have a long legacy of colonialism. So this is a lot of what this is and a lot of what this comes from. So the thing that will kind of change being able to try genocide and really being able to try other mass atrocity crimes is the introduction of the Rome Statute, which entered into force in 2002. So it's actually very modern. And essentially what it did is it created the International Criminal Court, the ICC, which would be a court that had jurisdiction over international events as long as people had ratified. They're seated at The Hague, which is in the Netherlands, and I still think it's wild that a city is called The Hague, but it is the city itself that is called The Hague. And they have a very close relationship with the UN. In fact, the Rome Statute was initiated by the UN. And what it did is this new international legal entity could now step across that imaginary fence that surrounded the chickens, right, in the proverbial chicken story. They could enter into the jurisdiction of other states, and they can overwrite it. But it's important to understand that they have very little in the realm of jurisdiction. There are only 4 crimes that they can try. Those crimes are genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. They can't try anything else from an international standpoint. And they only have jurisdiction over crimes that were that happened in a state after the creation of the Rome Statute. So only jurisdiction for crimes that happened after 2002, and only in the states that have ratified the Rome Statute. Right? So there are a lot of limits on this, but still is a huge step towards international governance. And you can see that even today, there are several countries that never signed in the first place, and several countries that never ratified. Do any of these stand out to you? You guys can amuse me and talk back to me, or I'll start calling on random strangers, because that's how I roll.
US.
The United States, right? So the United States has not yet ratified Rome. What do you think the United States is worried about?
Being held accountable.
Oh yeah, for what? What have we ever done wrong?
For numerous incidents in South America.
Or anything that we've done internally since 2002, right? Only 4 crimes, but still, some of them we have worked towards. What else? Any other big, major things happening in the world? Russia, Iran, Israel, right?
We're not in good company.
We rarely are. Right, but these are all states that don't fall under the ICC. Actually, most of the states who have ratified the ICC are many of the states that never ratified the Genocide Convention, which is why a majority, if there's only one exception to this, a majority of the crimes that have been tried by the ICC to date have been in Latin America and Africa, up to now. There is one with Ukraine because Ukraine did ratify. And if it happens on Ukrainian territory, then it can count under this. Also, there's double jeopardy, if you care. So one of the most important things about the Rome Statute is actually this clause right here, or at least in my opinion, it is this clause right here. And this is, this applies to legal precedent writ large. You have to stick to the definitions of crime, right? You can't imbue it with your own thoughts and feelings about whether or not something constitutes genocide. It actually has to match the definition to be tried in international court. And this will apply to all of the other mass atrocity crimes that I'm going to talk about. And I'm only going to talk about 5 today. But it's important that we understand these definitions matter. So you can't just call anything that offends you genocide, right? It doesn't actually mean that it is. So we know the definition of genocide pretty well already. The definition is the one that is set forth by the UN definition of genocide. There are also a couple other mass atrocity crimes that are triable under the ICC, the Rome Statute. Those are crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression is also triable. But there is a related term, ethnic cleansing. It cannot be tried, but is very, very deeply related. You guys are going to be so annoyed with me. Are you ready? Sorry. I told you the words matter in this case. I don't want you to think I'm just making them up over here. So crimes against humanity. It is essentially any one of the following 11 acts when it's part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population as part of a state or organizational policy to commit such an attack. Most important things to take out of this. It has to be committed by a state or an organizational entity, not by an individual. or even a small group of individuals, a state or an organizational entity, and it has to be part of a widespread or systematic attack. Lots of people fight about the numbers here, but it has to be widespread or systematic. It can include things that we often see in genocide: murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation and forcible transfer. All of these things we often see in genocide, right? It can also include things like torture, rape, persecution, disappearance of people, the crime of apartheid. Everyone knows what that is, right? All right, perfect. And other inhuman acts, such as intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to bodily or mental or physical health. When we think of genocide, before we see the definition, this is often what people think of, right? But the legal definition of genocide, does anyone remember the piece that I highlighted and underlined?
Intent.
Intent, right? Without intent, you only have crimes against humanity. That is all you can try. The next one is going to be war crimes, and they look very similar again. But one of the things about war crimes that's going to make it very different is that it has a specific context. Genocide can happen during peacetime, though it often doesn't. And crimes against humanity can happen during peacetime. They often do. But war crimes cannot happen without the context of war. So there's always war that is occurring. And they always include directed attacks by the state and the military, right? So this would be the state or its military appendages attacking protected peoples. Peoples that are non-combatants, for a kind of shorthand of this. These can be former combatants who are no longer fighting. These often include civilian populations, for example. The attack on religious sites, historical sites, hospitals, ambulances, anyone who is marked as being clearly non-combatant, these are considered war crimes. And using prohibited methods of warfare. I don't know, say like cluster munitions, right? So these three things will make something a war crime. A genocide can be all three. It can be a war crime, a crime against humanity, and also genocide. And you can be tried with all three, but you have to meet the legal requirements for each one for it to be legal. There's also kind of this sister term, ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing shows up in the definitional stuff for two of these. And it can and often does lead to genocide, though not always. Ethnic cleansing is essentially the attempt to create a territory that is ethnically or nationally pure, and to remove all people from that territory who they perceive as not part of the dominant nationality or the dominant ethnicity. Sometimes this is murder or murderous in intent, and sometimes it looks like the forced transfer of populations from one area to another. But this ethnic cleansing almost always is one of the other three that I've mentioned so far, which is why it's so important to talk about. And then there is the final crime that can be tried by the ICC, and this is the crime of aggression. This is essentially starting a war, which is an international crime, you guys. I guess only if you signed the Rome Statute. Now you guys know why we haven't signed it. But it is illegal to invade another state's territory, to violate the UN Charter, to annex another state's territory, and to block or bombard territories. And in particular, blockading will prevent access to food and to other goods. There are at least a dozen places on the map right now in which this crime is actively occurring. But we very rarely hear that the ICC is trying it. Why do you think this is?
Tell us, teacher.
I don't I don't know the answer, right? There's all kinds of different answers.
I mean, I
Jay?
would say partly jurisdictional problems, but also, the hard answer might be, maybe not everyone's answer, but international institutions are weak and have no teeth and have no enforcement and have little support.
You know what the ICC doesn't really have? A military. You know what the UN also doesn't have?
Yeah.
They do have peacekeepers though, and sometimes they wield guns, but that's a conversation for another day. But really, yes, we have weak international institutions, but one of the biggest things is definitions. We have had several opportunities to intervene internationally, and as opposed to making decisions to do so, we sit in rooms and quibble about whether it meets all of these definitional requirements. And by the time somebody has figured out if it meets these definitional requirements, what do you think has happened? Millions, thousands of people have died, right? The thing about all of the things that I just talked to you about, they're all punitive, right? They punish people. And the only way in which they are preventative is maybe they deter. But I don't know if you know much about genocidal people. They're usually not generally deterred by things like this, especially if they have not ratified things like the Rome Statute or the UN Genocide Convention.
I guess part of the question to the answer I had was, even if it is, like, even if they do decide it is genocide, who's enforcing it? Like, who has permission to enforce it?
The ICC.
Through who?
That's the answer. No, I mean, the ICC can extract people, they can issue subpoenas for people, but they can't directly intervene. But the next thing that I'm going to talk to you about, R2P policy, technically means that every state that is in the UN has an obligation to prevent. Because there's another thing that was, again, more recently signed. It was an amendment to the Rome Statute in 2010. And it's called the responsibility to protect. And most of the UN, all of the states that have signed on to the Rome Statute have signed on to R2P. And responsibility to protect essentially says that we can't wait until it becomes a crime that is triable in a court after the fact. We have to do something as we start to see things that are indicative of genocide occurring. So the first tenet is that every state is responsible for intervening to protect its own population from mass atrocity crimes, including genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. So every state is responsible for protecting its own population. What might be the issue here? Who's usually genociding people? The state, right? In most cases, though not all, in most cases it is the state attacking its own people. So the state is responsible to stop itself from committing genocide. Could be an issue. The second one is that the wider international community has the responsibility to encourage and assist individual states in meeting that responsibility. This is very, very clear language. It does not say invade other territory and prevent them from committing genocide. It says assist and encourage other states to stop. This usually means things like sanctions, or strongly worded letters, or closing down diplomatic sites, or not having diplomatic visits or speeches, those kinds of things. But it does not mean boots on the ground to actively prevent a genocide in another place. Then the third pillar is a state is manifestly failing to protect its population. The international community must be prepared to take appropriate collective action in a timely and decisive manner and in accordance with the UN Charter. So all states who have signed on to the Rome Statute are signed on to the addendum in 2010. They all have to act in a timely and decisive matter. Anybody notice anything slippery about this language?
What is appropriate?
Yes. What is a timely
What is
matter?
timely? What is decisive?
What is
Well, it's collective
appropriate
action, too.
action and collective action, right? So what do you think happens when the international community is faced with a mass atrocity crime?
They sit in the committee room and
Argue about this shit, right? So in reality, up until this point, international legal frameworks, definitions, etc., have done a lot for making sense of what these crimes are, helping people understand the differences and nuances between them. However, they have been, for the most part, ineffective in terms of preventing future genocide. Right? And so the question is really, can we prevent it with what we have available to ourselves now? Can we do it? International courts, legal systems, etc., bodies, at this point in time cannot, right? The goal, though, and many of them that are working in these arenas will tell you, the goal is to eventually be able to, right? It's incremental change over the course of lifetimes. It took, after all, until 1948 for the word to ever be written down, even though we have historical evidence of genocide as far back as ancient Rome, right? So we know that this has been a crime that has existed for a long time. And then when do you prevent it, right? This is what you see. These are the 10 stages of genocide. These have been identified by several different scholars. The clearest one is an 8-stage framework, but